Hi, this is Lynn from Alamosa Quilt Company, and today I'm going to share with you one way you can do binding. This is my favorite way. There are many correct ways to do binding. I'm not by any means saying that this is the only way or the best way or anything like that. So if you do your binding differently, that's absolutely fine. This is the way that I like to do binding. So the first thing you need to do is cut your binding. I like to cut my binding just with the fabric strips. Sorry, I put my binding too far away from me. Just with the fabric strips, straight grain, okay? There is bias binding, okay? That's a whole nother thing. You do not have to do bias binding unless you are going around curved edges, okay? That's really the only reason you have to do bias binding. Bias binding is a little bit stronger because of the cross grains, okay? This is straight grain. Bias is cross grain. Cross grain on the edge is a little bit sturdier over time, but you know, it's also a lot more work and it's more wasteful for your fabric. And I'm just too lazy to do it if I'm not going around corners or if I'm not going around curves. Okay, so most patterns tell you to cut your binding 2.5 inches wide, which is fine. I, however, prefer to cut my binding 2¼ inches wide. I like 2¼ because for the thickness of the batting that I use and the way that I sew this on, if you use 2¼ inch wide, then it will look the same on both sides. Unless you see the full quilt, you can't tell from this which is the front and which is the back. Okay. The other thing is nice mitered corners. If these corners are not mitered nicely, um, if you don't sew it on properly, you're never going to get it mitered nicely. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to sew it on properly so that you can get nice mitered corners. And you can get nice mitered corners even if you do 2.5 inch wide binding with this. Okay, so cut your binding whatever width you want. There's a variety of ways to end the binding. So I'm just showing you one way. All right, so I have my binding strips already cut, okay, at 2¼ and now I'm going to show you how I sew the strips together. I sew them on a diagonal. You can sew them on a straight, but if you sew them on the diagonal, then it distributes the bulk of that seam so that when you're feeling along the edge of the quilt, you can't really feel very well where the joins are. And if you joined it on the straight, then the seam allowance gets folded in over itself and it makes a little lump. If you prefer to do it that way, it's absolutely fine, okay? But that's not the way I do it. So this video is how I do it. So let's go to the sewing machine and sew our strips together. All right. So for my method, I'm going to sew these together on a diagonal. The first strip, this is my first, and notice I did not cut the salve edges off because I'm going to kind of use those for marking because I don't like to do much marking. However, I did draw the line on this first one so that you can see. The first strip needs to go right side up with the fabric to your left. The second strip needs to go right sides down and the strip needs to be coming towards you. Okay, and you see I've drawn the line. Now what I usually do is I just line up the fabric. I make with the salve edges, and I'm going to sew from this corner all the way to this corner. And I have this diagonal seam tape. There's lots of other products you can put down that has this line. This red line lines up right with my needle. This is a washi tape. It won't leave a residue. It doesn't stay stuck forever. It does, you can see I've had to tear it off a little bit. But you get a 10-yard roll. It's basically a lifetime supply for less than 10 bucks. So you can just get a new piece. But there's lots of other products as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the point right up that red line. And you can see as it comes to the other side how that point is coming right up that red line. And I'm going to be sewing right here. And so let's do that. Ah. Okay, so now you take this strip, which was your top strip or your second strip, the one that was pointed towards you, and just flip it over so that it is right side up and now coming off the left side, and then get the next piece of binding fabric. Okay, and so this is the bottom one, right side up, and then the next one goes wrong side up towards you, and I'm just going to offset it so that the salve edges, so that I get my nice little corners, and I'm going to take this corner up here and sew to the other corner. And notice I didn't even cut my thread or anything like that, and if I needed another one, okay, then I would just keep doing this. I'm not cutting the thread or anything like that. This binding, this fabric I'm using is printed, so the right and the wrong sides are obviously different. If you're using a batik or solid or anything that's dyed, then it can be a problem. It doesn't matter which side you choose as the right or the wrong side. The problem comes where you get some of your seams on one side of the strip and some of your seams on the other side of the strip. So by following this method, where you always take the bottom strip goes right side up to your left, and the next strip goes right side down. Okay, this is just an extra strip I have. I guess I can go ahead and sew it on. The second strip goes right side down, okay, on here. And you must sew this way. You cannot sew it the other way. If you sew this way, you've made an elbow, not a straight line, and binding needs to be straight. I don't really need this extra binding, but I'll go ahead and do this one more time for you so you can see. And now I've already cut the salve edge off of this, so I just have a little bit of the fabric hanging up. Okay, so you do that, you get all your strips sewed together, and now we've got to go cut them and iron them in half. All right, I like to use a rotary cutter and a ruler when cutting my binding. So I find this is the last one I sewed on. Just find one of the ends and start. And you probably can't see it very well, but this is where the seam allowance is that I sewed. And so I'm going to take a ruler. This one has a nice 1/4 inch, and I'm going to put the 1/4 inch line right there. Or you can just put the 1/4 inch line to go from diagonal to diagonal, because that should be where you've sewn. I'll line that up, and I'm going to cut this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just like that. And then I just take and cut those dog ears right off, just right along the edge of the fabric. Okay, and then bring over the next join, and repeat right there, so that my 1/4 inch line goes from corner to corner. Cut and cut off the dog ears. Go to the next one. And repeat. And do that for all of them. This is my last one. And then I like to, at this point, you'll have two ends that have salve edge on them. So I just take and cut them off straight. Okay. I use one of the lines on my ruler across the top edge of the strip so that I can get it nice and square and cut that off. Okay. And then all of this is trash. All right, and now you want to fold this in half. Okay, so I take my binding. I think my iron is already warmed up. And you can just fold it in half, just like this. Take your iron, press, and then just keep folding. Just keep turning it under and keep pressing. However, what I prefer to do is I like this Binding Eaze tool. It comes, this is the original pink, and you can see it's well loved. They also come in blue and purple. And the way this works is you do have to press, you know, about 12 inches or so, just enough to go through here. And then this is silicone. Okay, so you're just going to park your iron on it. It is going to get hot and probably discolored, but you put your ironed end in up underneath the belt loops like this, and then you take your iron and you park your iron right on top, and then you just pull. The reason I like this is I don't have to clear off my entire ironing surface, because if you're like me, I am a horizontal surface abuser, which means that I stack stuff. If there's an empty horizontal surface, I'm going to stack crap on top of it. And I don't like to have to clean up all my mess every time I want to do binding. So this way, I just need a small area. And then you just keep pulling. Now it is hot on this end, so be careful with that. And you just keep pulling until you get it all the way through. When you come to a seam, I usually like to stop and press that seam open. And you can take and press all your seams open before you start. This is why I don't like pressing things open. So I'm going to do that real quick. It is easier when it's not to press this open, when it's not when it's not so close to the tool, the Binding Eaze tool. All right. And then just keep going. This little iron tends to pull to the side a bit because it's not very heavy. If you put a big iron on here, you don't have that problem because your big iron is heavier and it'll hold everything in place. Okay, and so you get the idea. All right, I'm going to do this and then we'll do the next step. Okay, before we go to the sewing machine, I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about what we're going to do. So the first thing you need to do is trim up your quilt so that it is square. And the corners need to be square. So get it nice and square, however you can do it. Then what we're going to do is I usually like to start on the bottom edge of the quilt. And I like to start, I don't know, leave about this much tail. And I'm going to start pretty close to the edge because I want to get the first corner. The corners are the hard part, and I want to get the first one over with as quickly as possible. I do the same thing when I'm sewing the binding on by hand when I'm sewing it to the back. But I'm going to start sewing about here. Okay, I'm going to sew and stop 1/4 of an inch from the corner, and I don't mark it, but you can mark it. What I like to do, this is where most people mess up, is you sew your corner wrong, and then there's no way to fix it. There's no way to miter it correctly because you've sewn it wrong. So come along with 1/4 of an inch or whatever seam allowance, okay? As long as you do the same seam allowance all the way up, everything will work. I like to use 1/4 inch seam allowance, but anyway, the same seam allowance. Come up, stop whatever your seam allowance is, you want to stop that distance from the corner. An easy way to do that without marking is to take your binding and fold it, okay, like this, and crease it with your finger. And then you'll have a crease, and you can just sew to the crease. Now, but you've got to put the crease in the correct place. So what needs to happen when you fold this back, okay, is it needs to be straight. The binding folded in half here at the corner needs to be straight with the edge of the quilt. If it is not, if it is over to the side like this or over to the side like this, you are never going to get that miter right because you have sewn it wrong. Okay, it's got to be this way. This needs to be a 45-degree angle. If everything is lined up here and this is straight, and you finger press it, okay, that is a 45-degree angle. You don't have to do any measuring. You don't have to know anything about math. This needs to be straight. Okay, now let's go to the sewing machine and actually sew it. Okay, I've changed the foot on my sewing machine to my walking foot. I always sew binding on with my walking foot. It just makes everything go on nicer. This is one of the things that this foot is for. So, the right tool for the job. And so, on my foot, I have some marks that help me. Right here, with the needle in the middle position, right here is 1/4 of an inch from the needle. So I'm going to be running the edge of my quilt and the edge of the binding. The raw edges of the binding go with the raw edges of the quilt. And I'm going to be running that right there so that I can get a nice 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I'm leaving a tail. And I'm going to come and start. Now I don't backstitch here because in case I didn't leave enough of a tail and I need to rip a little bit out, it's a little bit easier to do that if you haven't backstitched this. And the other thing is I have my machine set to stop in the needle down position. That also is helpful with this. So I'm going to start stitching. And I'm going to pull this up, okay, just a few more stitches so that you can see. Now I do the folding right here. So I'm coming to my first corner. I'm going to take this binding, line it up, crease it, make sure that it is straight. Okay, and by straight, I mean this edge right along the bottom. The quilt edge and the binding edge, as the binding edge is folded off the quilt, that needs to be a straight line. If it's not, fix it. Now when I open it back up, I have this crease. I am going to sew until my needle hits the crease, and then I'm going to turn everything and I'm going to sew right in the crease all the way to the corner. And now I'm going to cut the thread and pull it out and turn the whole thing. Okay, and I've already creased it and I've sewn right in that crease, so it will just fold right back. And again, make sure that this is straight. Right here is straight, and then fold this down, and this makes your miter. And now I just start sewing right at the edge. Okay, again, I'm coming to the second corner, so now I'm going to fold again. Get a nice crease. Make sure this is straight across. It's not curved up or down or anything like that. It's straight. Sew to the crease again. Stop, pivot, sew right in the crease all the way down to the corner. Cut your thread, pull it out, turn, fold it back on that crease that you made, and then down. And then the folded edge there should line up right at the edge of the, right at the raw edge of the quilt there. Okay, here we come to the third corner, and I want you to notice, so I do have a seam right here, but I am going to miss it. Technically, you should lay your binding out all on your project and make sure that no seam is going to come at the corner, hit at the corner, because it will make your corners much harder if you've got a seam there as well. I live dangerously and just, I don't worry about it. If a seam happens to fall right at the corner, then I just rip back a little bit, cut the binding, cut the corner, and and move the corner. So fold it, but I don't have to worry about it on this because I got lucky. Okay, again, very important. This edge is straight. The edge of the quilt, the edge of the binding with it folded is straight. Sew to the crease. Pivot, sew along the crease to the corner. Cut your thread. Fold it back on the crease, making sure again that this edge is straight. And come down and line up that folded edge right with the top, right with that edge of the quilt. last corner, fold, press, make sure it's straight, sew to the crease. Turn, sew to the corner, right in the crease. Cut your thread, turn the whole thing. Okay. Fold it back on that crease that you made, making sure that everything is straight. Fold it back. Start sewing. Now this is my last side. And so I'm going to take the time right now, before I get too far, to go find the end where I started. So here's where I started. And I don't measure, but I'm going to go what looks like about a foot from that. And I'm going to put a pin. Just put a pin in there right there. And I'm going to sew to that. And I do back stitch here because I know I've left myself enough space. Cut the thread. And now we're going to take the quilt off the machine, and I'm going to go around to the other camera and let me show you how to measure and cut for, this will be an invisible join. All right, just like sewing the binding on, there are lots of different ways to end. This is the way I end. Now, for my technique, it's essential that so I always start at the bottom, okay? You need that edge where you're doing the join to be away from you and the rest of the quilt down here, okay? It doesn't work any other way. Here you can see my two ends. And then I like to use a little bitty mat like this. Pick any line, doesn't matter which line, just pick a line and put that line at the top edge of the quilt. And then I'll slide it along. I usually use this line. Okay, and this is where I started sewing over here. This is where I stopped sewing over here. So you want to put this on the first edge. I guess with the quilt away from you, it will be on your right. And so I land it and get this binding right here so that it's right on that line. Then I move that one out of the way. I take the left side one and pull it straight. Make sure it's nice and straight. And whatever width you cut your binding, that is how far off this line, which is where this one ended, okay, that you want to cut. My binding was cut 2 1/4 inches, so I am going to cut this left-hand piece 2 1/4 inches from this line, because that's the line where this binding, where the first side stopped. So I put the 2 1/4 inch line right there on this line and cut. Okay, so what this does is now your two ends overlap. They overlap the width of the binding. So however you cut it, that's the width that you need. If you cut it 2.5, they need to overlap 2.5 inches. If you cut it 3 inches, they need to overlap 3 inches. Doesn't matter what measurement it is, but they need to overlap that amount. Now get a marking pen, okay? And again, you want to mark on this edge, the first edge. This is where I started sewing. Here's the tails. I'm going to go ahead and cut those from where I started. So it's the right hand one. Open it out, and this is why you need to leave some opening, is so that you can open it out flat. Take your ruler, and I am going to mark the top edge of this 2.25 inches from this edge. Put a little mark right there. And then I'm going to take the ruler, and I'm using that mark that I made that's 2.25 inches from here, and I'm going to draw to this corner. Now, this is not symmetric in any way. It must be the top edge of this binding, which is the bottom part. You must do this angle. These are not symmetric. If you want this to be straight, it has to be this way. And remember, most of my quilts this way. The edge that I'm working on is away from me. This does not work if you flip everything around, okay? I mean, it will work, but you have to draw differently. So now I usually get a couple pins, and I've got some right here, okay? And so this edge is right side up, okay? And it goes off to the left like this. And then I'm going to take this one, and this is just the exact way we did it when we were sewing them together, but this time everything is cut, so you have to line things up. Okay, and I put some pins in there, and I'm going to sew directly on this line. Okay, so here I am at the sewing machine, and I've got everything, so you just kind of got to pull this away from the quilt. That's why you need, some space here. You can't get too close. You can't stop too close because you need space to do this. On small projects, this can be a challenge, but there are other ways to end, and sometimes on small projects I use a different method. Okay, and now sew directly on the line. Clip your threads. You can pull your pins out. And now we're going to check it, okay? Before you cut anything, you're going to check it and make sure that it's right. Because if it's not right, you can easily rip this out and sew it again. But if you've cut it, you're kind of committed. Okay, so I take it, I lay it out, I check and make sure that there's no twists or anything like this, and that everything lays flat. I mean, as flat as it can before you trim this, because if it's twisted, you need to rip it out and fix it. If it doesn't lay flat, you can sew just a slightly narrower seam until you can get it to be flat. But this lays pretty flat. So then what I do is pull this out of the way. Now you can just cut this with scissors, but I've got this handy dandy mat right here, and so I'm putting the 1/4 inch line directly on where I sewed, and I'm just going to cut that. These triangles here, that's trash. And then I'm going to press that seam open. And then I like to take it and hit it with the iron, especially right there where I just pressed, to repress where the folds are. And then I like to use some clips. And so I'm going to put a few clips here in this edge. Before going over to the sewing machine, and I'll start sewing where I left off, right, which is right here. I'm going to start there, and I'm going to sew to where I started, and I'll back stitch in both places. Okay. All right, I'm going to find, this is where I ended, so I'm going to put my foot down and kind of start a few stitches and go a few stitches over the top, and then I'll back stitch and then keep going. And my binding got pulled a little bit. There we go. And now this is where I started. I'll sew over it a few stitches, and then I'll go back. And then the binding is all attached to the front of the quilt. Okay, now I do like to press my binding from the front all the way around and get in that corner good. This just helps it to reinforce that I want it to fold this way. Whoops. Okay, so now I've ironed it all. And I like to use Wonder Clips, okay? And I will clip the entire thing as long as I have enough clips. If it's a king size quilt, I might have to clip it a couple times because if I don't have enough clips. But, so, when we folded on the front, okay, the miter, this piece is underneath this piece, okay? When we fold it on the back, we want it to go the opposite way so that you don't have a lumpy corner. So I sew my binding on like this, going around on the back side. I'm going to take it. I usually start clipping at a corner. So I'll fold this down, put a clip, and go back just a bit. Okay. But now we got to go this way. So at this corner, pull it up so you can see it better. At this corner, fold it, okay? Make sure that it's right, okay? If you get it and it looks like this, that's not quite right. Keep messing with it until it's right, okay? Fold it like that, and then this comes over, and you want the corner of it, to be right at that edge. So this is just clipped at this point. When I come to sew it, I'll play with it more. But then I'm just going to keep going. And I go about that far apart. It is not necessary to clip all the way around. It's not necessary to clip at all. I just find if I don't, I end up with a death grip on the quilt with my left hand. And my left hand starts cramping, and all it's doing is holding the binding down. And I don't know why I feel like I have to hold it so hard. I don't, I just do. But when I have it clipped, I tend to not do that. So just clip all the way around. Let's come to another corner. Okay. Fold it. Okay. And if you've mitered everything properly to start with, you should get a nice 45 right there. Fold it over. And you want the end of the miter to be right at the end of the, right at the fold here of the binding. Put a clip. I'm going to need some more clips. Okay, so what I mean by opposing sides on the miter, so this side is on top of this side. When you flip it over, this side is on top of this side, and that's opposite from the back. So that distributes the bulk. If you sew your binding on going around this way, then it's not easy to miter it opposite of the front. Okay, and so that's why I do it this way. So I'm sewing on the binding this way around, not the other way. Okay, get some thread. I like to use binding needles. The reason I like binding needles is, number one, I believe in the right tool for the job, but number two, they're long, they're strong, they don't bend, and I don't know if you've ever sewn binding on and you get a bunch of bendy needles. And they're a little longer than I was used to start with, but with a little bit of practice, I now really like them. Usually I like to match my thread to the binding fabric, but I wanted you to be able to see my stitches, and I'm probably going to do slightly larger stitches than I usually do so that you can see them. And then I'll take this out because this is a real store sample. So knot your thread, and I'll show you how I do. This is a quilter's knot or a surgeon's knot. Ah, all right. So needle is between my middle finger and thumb. And then I put the thread over the top and I pinch with my index finger. Okay, now it's got my index finger and thumb. And I'm going to wrap the thread several times, however many times you want. I usually do 4 or 5. And then keep your fingers pinched. You want pinched tight enough to hold the thread where it is, but not so tight that you can't pull the needle. And then you just pull the needle, keeping your thumb and forefinger pinched. Just pull, and then you get a knot. Okay. I like to start fairly close to a corner, again, because corners are the hardest part, and I want to get the first one over with as quickly as possible. So I'm going to take out one of these, this first clip. I put the thread, the needle into the seam allowance here, and just take a little stitch, and I angle it so I come out pretty close to my machine stitching line. Fold the binding fabric over. Picking up the needle is proven to be difficult. Okay, I do use a thimble. Okay, so the thread came out right here, and you just want to cover this line just up by a tad. And I take very small little stitches, so I'm going to go into, I'm into the quilt. Okay, you don't want to go all the way to the front, right? You want to just the backing and maybe a tad of the batting. And I take very small stitches. That's about 1/8 of an inch. And then I pick up the binding fabric, pull it through. Okay, and then take another stitch. You want to go down into the quilt directly opposite. Don't go from side to side. You'll see your stitches more. You want nice straight stitches. And even there you can barely see it. Okay, so I'm going, the thread is coming out of the binding, okay, and I want to go down into the quilt exactly in that same place as close as I can and take another very small stitch. Okay, when I get to a quilting line right here, sometimes I like to flip it over, and I don't know if you can see, but I can see my needle peeking through. All right, so before I pull it through and then have to unthread the needle and pull it back, I check. Okay, so that's gonna show a bit of black on the front, and I don't want that. So I'll pull the needle back out and try again. And with practice, you'll be able to feel it. You won't have to keep turning every time. You'll be able to feel it. And I turned it over because I could feel that what I had done, but I wanted to show you. Okay, I'm coming towards the corner now, so I'm going to take this clip out. Okay, now I'm right at the next line of stitching here. And so before I start folding, I like to take an extra little stitch right here just to hold that. Sometimes I'll do two and kind of do a little knot. Just go up underneath the thread and make just a little knot right there. And that holds that side in place. So now I know that that's not going anywhere and I can mess with the other side. So then I like to turn it. Okay. And I'm going to play with this until it's right. So if you get it and it looks like this, okay, your corner's a little bit off, open it back out, fold it again. Do it until it's right, okay? If you sew it in wrong, it's wrong. You can't fix it then. And we sewed it to the front correctly. Remember, if you haven't sewn it to the front correctly, this is pointless. And now I'm going to take a stitch right here. And I am going to sew this corner closed. So I'm not going to rely on the fact that it's going to stay. I'm going to sew it the way I want it. I'm going all the way up to the corner. It's usually 2 or 3 stitches. Okay, I'm at the corner now. Give it a little tug, and I'm going to go right through the quilt to the front. And I'm going to come out on the corner at the front. Whoops, oh, I pulled it right out the wrong way. Come out the corner at the front. Oh, I unthreaded my needle. That's what I did. Hang on. Okay, so now I'm on the front and I'm going to sew the corner shut from the front as well. It's just 2 or 3 stitches. And then right here at the corner, I am going to go to the back again. And if necessary, I want to come up right here. I'm not there. So you just pull it back out and adjust it over until you get it where you want it. Tuck any fraying up underneath and keep going. Ah! Just unthreaded my needle again. This is kind of hard to do with a camera in your face, to be honest with you. And you just keep going. Okay. When you get to the end of your thread and you need to knot it off and get another thread, then this is the way I do it. Okay. So I've still got plenty of thread, but I don't want to do the whole thing in black. So I'm going to stop here and show you. So I usually do 2 little stitches, so I catch just a little bit of the back of the quilt and a little bit of the binding. and I pass my needle through the loop. Do that one time, and then I do it a second time. A little bit of the quilt back, tad of the binding, through like that. And then I run the needle up underneath, in between the binding and the quilt. Pull it out here, clip it. Okay. I knot my thread, again, just the same way. Get the next thread, and then pull the binding back, put the needle in, wherever it'll go. And then I bring the needle up really close to where I just knotted it off. And then keep going. And you just go all the way around the quilt this way. I do all 4 corners exactly like I did. I sew them shut, okay? You get the miter, you get it fold, sew it in the proper position. Then you know it will stay. If you don't sew it shut, things can shift over time when it gets washed or, you know, with use or something like that. If you want it to stay where you want it, you need to sew it in place. And then the stitches are really pretty invisible. You can see a little bit, but I like to use Aurifil thread for sewing on the binding because it's really nice and thin and it's strong. This is a 50 weight Aurifil. I like that, and the binding needles and my wonder clips, and I always have a thimble when doing this. And so that's how I bind a quilt.